Ever wonder what it sounds like when someone decides you're no longer worth the effort? It doesn't sound like shouting or slammed doors. It's just a phone that stops ringing and a side of the bed that stays cold for so long you forget it was ever warm. My name is Ryan Coleman. I'm 35 years old, and a year and a half ago I was lying on a mattress in my grandmother's old ranch house outside Livingston, Montana, burning up with a 103-degree fever, listening to tires crunch gravel as the woman I was supposed to marry drove off without a backward glance. I didn't know it then, but that drive away from me turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to her, for about 11 months. After that, it became the biggest regret of her life. But I'm jumping ahead, and a story like this deserves to be told properly. So let me back up. I grew up on that ranch. 40 acres of grassland, fence posts, and unpredictable Montana weather, roughly 20 minutes outside Livingston, past where the gift shops end and real ranch country begins. My father, Dean Coleman, ran cattle on that land alongside my grandmother, Eleanor Coleman, who'd owned the property since 1968. My mother, Carol Coleman, handled the bookkeeping, the vet appointments, the school pickups. All of it, while somehow still finding time to can vegetables every autumn like she was preparing for a siege. I was an only child, spoiled the way ranch kids are spoiled, meaning I had no free time and no allowance whatsoever, but I had two parents who loved that land and loved me on it. I learned to drive a tractor before I learned to drive a car, and I learned how to help deliver a calf before I ever worked up the nerve to ask a girl to a dance. That was just how things worked out there. When I graduated high school in 2009, I faced the same fork in the road everyone in that town eventually hits. Stay and run the family operation, or leave and find out what else existed. I chose the second option, not because I didn't love the ranch. I did, more than I ever let myself admit back then. But I wanted to build something that was mine, something separate from being known only as Dean and Carol's kid. So I enrolled at the University of Wyoming, studied business, and afterward landed a job in Portland, Oregon, doing supply chain analysis for a logistics firm. Good salary, good city, and a comfortable distance from home. About a 14-hour drive, which sounds manageable until you're the one making it twice a year for the holidays. My parents were proud of me. My father called every Sunday night without fail, just to check in on how the city life suited me. And every call ended the exact same way. "The land isn't going anywhere, Ryan. Come home whenever you're ready." I always told him I would. I meant it, too. I just figured I had time. In October 2015, my parents drove down through Idaho to visit my mother's sister in Twin Falls, a trip they'd made countless times without incident. On the way back, on a stretch of highway just outside Pocatello, an oncoming semi-driver fell asleep at the wheel and crossed into their lane. My parents died instantly. I was 24, sitting at my desk in Portland, when a sheriff's deputy I'd never spoken to before called to tell me both my parents were gone. I won't try to dress that day up with anything poetic. It was the worst day of my life, and there's no elegant way to phrase that. I drove home that same night, breaking every speed limit through Idaho and Montana, and arrived in time to help my grandmother handle arrangements neither of us was prepared to make. Grandma Eleanor was 78 then, and she'd just lost her only son. I watched a woman who had buried a husband, survived 2 droughts, and single-handedly run a working ranch for years, completely collapse in on herself for about a month. Then, slowly, she pulled herself back up, because that's what her generation does. She kept the ranch running with the help of one part-time hired hand and, more than anyone, a neighbor's daughter named Claire Bennett. I honestly didn't think much of Claire at the time. She was a few years younger than me, the daughter of the Bennetts, who owned the property bordering ours to the east. She came by a couple of times a week to help my grandmother with chores, feeding livestock, mending fence, the kind of physical work that gets harder on a body every year, whether it admits it or not. I'd pass her occasionally during visits home after the funeral, a polite nod, a few words about the weather. I had no idea, grieving in Portland, that this woman would eventually be the reason I made it through what came next, years down the road. Life has a way of setting up its dominoes long before you ever notice them falling. After the funeral, I went back to Portland. I told myself it was because of the job, the apartment lease, the life I'd built there. The truth was simpler. Going back to the ranch full-time meant accepting that my parents were really gone, in a way that staying in the city let me avoid. My grandmother never pressured me about it. She just kept doing what she always did, kept the ranch alive through her own grit and Claire's help, and reminded me every time I called that the door. And the land would be waiting whenever I was ready. 3 years later, in 2018, I met the woman I'd eventually get engaged to. Her name was Megan Ashford. I met Megan at a friend's birthday dinner at a restaurant in one of Portland's trendier neighborhoods, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and a wine list longer than the actual menu. She worked in marketing for a cosmetics company headquartered downtown. Sharp, funny, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and make you feel like the only interesting person there, when she wanted to. We hit it off immediately. Within 6 months, we were basically living together. And within 2 years, in the spring of 2020, I proposed to her on a hiking trail overlooking the city, and she said yes before I'd even fully pulled the ring out of my jacket pocket. For a while, things were genuinely good. Megan was ambitious and driven, someone who knew exactly what she wanted from life, and at the time I admired that about her. We talked about the future, kids eventually, a house, the usual milestones. But here's the part I didn't recognize clearly enough back then, the part I only understand in hindsight. Megan's relationship with her mother, a woman named Diane Ashford, wasn't a typical mother-daughter dynamic. It was closer to a business arrangement. Diane had opinions on everything. Megan's career, Megan's wardrobe, Megan's friendships, and eventually, Megan's choice of partner. Diane had grown up with almost nothing, worked her way into a comfortable lifestyle through 2 marriages, the second to a man with real money. And she'd built her entire philosophy around the idea that security came from what a man could provide, period. Love was fine. Love didn't cover a mortgage payment. That line was practically gospel in that household. In the beginning, Diane tolerated me because I had a stable job and reasonable prospects. That matters for what comes later. I wasn't struggling, and I wasn't some charity case. I was a logistics analyst doing perfectly well for a guy in his late 20s. But perfectly well was never going to satisfy Diane Ashford, not when she'd spent years convincing her daughter she was meant for something bigger. By 2022, life in Portland had begun wearing on both of us in ways that are honestly common but rarely discussed. Rent had climbed to a number that made my stomach turn every month. My job kept dangling a promotion that never quite arrived. Megan's job had its own pressures. Long hours, office politics, a manager who took credit for her ideas more than once. We were tired constantly. We still loved each other, but we were 2 exhausted people barely crossing paths except to sleep. One night that fall, unable to sleep, I brought up something I'd been quietly turning over for months. My grandmother, now 85, still had the ranch, but her hired hand had retired, and Claire Bennett, while still helping when her schedule allowed, had her own family operation demanding more of her time as her parents got older. Grandma Eleanor needed real help, and the ranch itself, 40 acres with solid water rights in a corner of Montana becoming more desirable by the year, was sitting there, underused. What if we went back? I asked Megan. Not permanently, necessarily, but what if we relocated to my grandmother's place, helped her run it the right way, maybe even built something of our own out there? The land's already paid off, no rent draining us every month. We could finally save real money, put something toward a wedding, start thinking about kids, build something that was ours instead of just getting by in the city. I expected pushback. I got none. Not at first. Megan actually seemed to like the idea, or at least said she did, and I believed her completely at the time. She talked about wanting space to think, wanting out of the rat race, wanting a slower pace before starting a family. We spent weeks planning it out. I gave notice at my job in January 2023. We broke our apartment lease and told our friends we were relocating to Montana that spring to help run a family ranch and build a future there together. I had no idea that somewhere in the middle of those weeks of planning, Diane Ashford had already started making calls of her own. Looking back now, I can pinpoint almost exactly when things began to shift, because Megan's behavior changed in ways that felt explainable at the time but were obvious in hindsight. It was a Sunday evening in February 2023, about 6 weeks before our planned move. Megan had gone quiet after a phone call with her mother, the kind of call that used to last 10 minutes and now ran past an hour. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Fine," she said, still staring at her phone. "My mom just thinks we're moving too fast. We've been planning this for months," I said. "She just worries. I let it go." That's the thing about slow erosion. You don't notice the ground disappearing beneath you until you're already standing on nothing. Over the following weeks, Megan began raising small doubts. What if the ranch didn't generate enough income? What if she got bored out there? What if we were sacrificing too much security for a fantasy that sounded better in theory than it would feel in practice? Each doubt sounded reasonable in isolation. Strung together, it was a campaign, and I simply didn't recognize it as one yet. We moved anyway, in April 2023. To her credit, she packed up her half of the apartment, helped load the moving truck, and spent 2 days in the cab with me driving north through Idaho and into Montana, watching the scenery shift from city sprawl to wide-open sky. She even seemed happy for a stretch of that drive, feet on the dashboard, singing along to the radio somewhere past the Idaho border. I held on to that image for a long time afterward, longer than I probably should have. We moved into the guest house on my grandmother's property, which we'd fixed up together on earlier visits, and for the first couple of months, it genuinely seemed like it might work. Megan pitched in with chores, started a small freelance marketing gig for a few local businesses, working out of the house, and my grandmother adored her the way grandmothers adore anyone who shows up and tries. But the calls with Diane kept coming. 2 or 3 times a week, often over an hour long. And each time Megan hung up, something in her had drifted a little further from where we'd started. By the fall of 2023, the freelance work had mostly dried up. Megan spent more time on her phone, ran errands in town that stretched far longer than errands should, and spent less time on the ranch. I told myself it was an adjustment period. People need time to settle into a new life. I wasn't wrong about that part. I just didn't realize her footing was being redirected elsewhere entirely, one phone call at a time. Then, in November 2023, I got sick. It started like an ordinary flu, fever, chills, the kind of thing you push through with soup and rest for a few days. Except it didn't pass. By the second week, I could barely get out of bed. My fever kept spiking past 103. I dropped nearly 15 pounds in a month because I couldn't hold food down. A doctor in Livingston eventually diagnosed it as a severe case of viral myocarditis, inflammation of the heart muscle triggered by a virus that had probably started out ordinary and escalated because my body, worn down from stress and exhaustion, hadn't fought it off properly. The doctor was blunt with me. Rest, medication, careful monitoring, and time. That was the only way through it. Push too hard, too soon, and the inflammation could cause permanent heart damage. I was 32 years old and being told to move through my own house like an elderly man because my heart genuinely couldn't handle more than that. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters for everything that follows. I wasn't faking weakness. I wasn't exaggerating for sympathy. My heart was inflamed and unstable, and doctors were telling me plainly that overexertion could be fatal. That's the man Megan was looking at every day that winter. Not someone giving up. Someone fighting an illness that genuinely could have killed him. My grandmother, 86 by then, did what she could, but she had her own health to manage and couldn't be lifting me out of bed or tracking my medication schedule alone. For about 6 weeks, it was mostly Megan handling my care, bringing meals, managing prescriptions, helping me to the bathroom on the worst days. I remember being grateful for that. I remember telling her, more than once, half delirious with fever, that I didn't know what I'd do without her. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to find out exactly what that looked like. By January 2024, Diane Ashford had stopped pretending to worry about Megan's happiness on the ranch and started saying, openly, on calls Megan no longer bothered hiding from me, that her daughter was wasting her life, nursing a man who might never fully recover. I caught pieces of those calls from the next room, too weak most days to even get up and confront it directly. Diane had someone she wanted Megan to meet. A man named Gordon Whitmore, a hedge fund manager based in Chicago, mid-40s, recently divorced, exactly the type of man Diane had been hunting for her daughter since long before I'd ever entered the picture. In late January, Megan told me she needed to fly back to Portland for a week to handle some business matters and check on her mother, who wasn't doing well. I believed her, because I had no reason not to, and because I genuinely couldn't have stopped her, even if I'd suspected something. I could barely walk to the kitchen on my own most days. She never came back. A week turned into 2. 2 turned into 3. Every time I called, she answered, but the calls got shorter and the excuses got thinner. Her mother needed her. A client emergency. She'd be back soon. She just needed a little more time to sort things out. I want to tell you, I saw it coming, but I didn't. Not fully. Not yet. I was a man who'd lost nearly 20 pounds, whose heart was still inflamed enough that my cardiologist in Livingston, Dr. Sarah Kim, had me on a strict no-stress, no-exertion plan for at least another 2 to 3 months. I spent most of January and February 2024 in bed or in a recliner by the wood stove, my grandmother bringing me soup with hands that trembled a little more than they used to, neither of us talking much about where Megan actually was, because neither of us wanted to say the thing we were both starting to suspect. In early March 2024, Megan called and told me, in a voice that sounded rehearsed, that she'd decided to stay in Portland, that she'd done a lot of thinking, that she didn't think she was cut out for ranch life, for being a caretaker, for the kind of uncertainty my health had introduced into what was supposed to be our future. She said she still loved me, but that love wasn't always enough, and that her mother had helped her see things more clearly. What things? I asked her, my voice not even angry, just tired. Ryan, you need real care right now, more than I can give you out there. You should focus on getting better, I think. I think it's better if we take some space. Space. That was the word she used, while I sat in a recliner with a heart monitor app on my phone, alone except for an 86-year-old woman who had already buried her own son. I didn't know it then, but that call was the last real conversation Megan and I would have for almost a year. Over the following weeks, I tried calling, texting. I sent one long message in late March, laying out everything I felt. Not angry, just honest, asking her to at least talk to me properly instead of disappearing by degrees. She read it. I could see the read receipt. She never responded. By April, my calls started going straight to voicemail. By May, my number didn't ring through at all. She'd blocked me. I later learned, through a mutual friend from our Portland days named Nicole Ferris, that Diane Ashford had introduced Megan to a hedge fund manager named Gordon Whitmore within about a month of her landing back in Oregon, and that Diane had made it her full-time mission to keep Megan too busy, too distracted, and too convinced that I was a sinking ship to ever look back. Nicole told me Diane had said at a dinner Nicole happened to attend that Megan finally had a real shot at the kind of life she deserved, and that Gordon could give her everything that ranch never would. You want to talk about a gut punch? That one landed secondhand over a phone call in May 2024, while I was still regaining the strength to walk to my own mailbox without getting winded. Here's where I need to talk about Claire Bennett, because this is where she stops being a background figure in my life and becomes the reason I'm even telling this story today. Claire was 30 that spring, the youngest of 3 Bennett kids who'd grown up on the ranch bordering ours. She'd left Montana for a few years after college, worked as a large animal veterinary technician in Idaho, and moved back home in 2022 when her father's hip surgery meant the Bennett operation needed more hands. She and my grandmother had stayed close that whole time. A friendship that started with chores and quietly became something neither of them bothered to name because it didn't need one. Claire just showed up. That's who she was. After Megan left, Claire started coming by more often. At first, just to check on my grandmother, who at 86 was managing both her own health and watching her grandson go through something brutal. But it didn't take long before Claire was checking on me too. Bringing meals, sitting with me on the porch some evenings when I had the energy to be out there. Not saying much, just present in a way that asked nothing of me. I remember one evening in June 2024, about 4 months after Megan left, sitting on that porch with Claire, watching the sun set over the fence line. I was still weak, my color only just starting to return. "You don't have to keep doing this," I told her. "Coming by. I know you've got your own place to run." She just shrugged, the way she did when she didn't feel like explaining herself. "Your grandmother's been good to my family for 30 years. Then, glancing over at me with a half-smile that I'd later come to recognize as her tell for saying something she'd thought through more than she let on, she added, "Besides, somebody's got to make sure you're eating something other than canned soup." I laughed. That summer, my health slowly started turning a corner. Dr. Kim cleared me for light activity in July 2024, then moderate activity by September. The inflammation in my heart had eased enough that follow-up scans showed real progress, though she was clear that full recovery. Getting back to real physical ranch work without limits would likely take close to a full year from the initial diagnosis. I held on to that timeline. I gave myself a mental deadline, 1 year from diagnosis. That was when I'd know. What I didn't expect was how much of myself I'd rediscover in the work itself. Here's something I never really told Megan, not in any real detail, because by the time we were together, I'd already buried that version of myself under a logistics job in a Portland apartment. I didn't just grow up on a ranch. Before college, I'd spent 2 summers in high school working under a regional agricultural extension consultant, learning soil management, rotational grazing, water rights law. The business side of small operations, not just the labor. I'd actually planned, back in high school, to study agricultural business and come home to modernize my father's operation. Then my parents died, and somewhere in the grief and moving forward, I let that version of myself go quiet. Portland didn't need a man who understood soil composition. It needed a man who understood supply chain spreadsheets. But sitting on that ranch recovering, with too much time on my hands and a body that wasn't ready for hard labor but was more than ready to think, all of that old knowledge started waking back up. In August 2024, even before I was fully cleared for physical work, I started making calls. to the regional extension office, to a few small operations around the valley, including the Bennett Ranch. I started asking questions about water rights on our property, about whether the land was being used anywhere near its potential, about what a real rotational grazing and small-scale grass-fed beef operation could look like on 40 acres with strong water access, 20 minutes from a city like Livingston that had, over the last decade, become one of the fastest-growing food and tourism markets in the entire state. My grandmother watched all of this unfold with an expression I can only describe as quiet pride. "Your daddy used to talk about doing exactly this," she told me one afternoon, sitting beside me on the porch while I scribbled notes on a legal pad. "Never had the capital to do it right. You might." She was right. I had something my father never had: savings from years of a city salary that I'd been putting toward a future that no longer existed with her in it, plus the prospect, however distant it felt then, of an inheritance from land that had been debt-free for decades. I wasn't going to sit around feeling sorry for myself. I was going to build something. By October 2024, I was strong enough to start real physical work again, carefully, under Dr. Kim's continued supervision. I started small, repairing fence line with Claire's help most weekends, converting a portion of the ranch's underused acreage into a rotational grazing system built specifically for a premium grass-fed beef operation, something I'd researched obsessively for months. I reached out to an old contact from my Portland days, a man named Dave Marsh, who worked in regional food distribution, and started laying groundwork for a direct-to-restaurant supply relationship. The kind of arrangement that could turn a small Montana operation into something genuinely profitable instead of merely surviving. I didn't know it yet, but a developer out of Livingston had also started quietly buying up smaller ranch properties throughout our valley that fall, offering just enough money to tempt cash-strapped families with plans to convert the land into a luxury subdivision. The Bennetts had already turned down one offer, as had two other neighboring families. I'd find out soon enough that my grandmother's ranch, sitting right in the middle of that stretch of valley, was exactly the kind of property they wanted next. By November 2024, 1 year after my diagnosis, I was, for all practical purposes, healthy. Dr. Kim cleared me for full activity at my follow-up appointment, told me my heart function had returned to normal range, and said the words I'd been waiting 12 months to hear. "Ryan, you're not a cardiac patient anymore. Go live your life." That same week, Claire and I had our first conversation that wasn't about ranch work or my recovery. We were sitting on the porch, same spot as always, and she asked me, carefully, like she'd been building up to it for a while, whether I'd heard anything from Megan. "Not since May," I told her. She blocked my number. "Doesn't matter anymore." Claire nodded slowly, then said something that stuck with me ever since. "For what it's worth, Ryan, I think you handled all of it better than most people would have. You didn't get bitter. You got busy. It almost wasn't an option," I admitted. "There were nights I wanted to throw my phone in the river." She laughed, then, quieter, said, "I'm glad you didn't. I kind of like having you around." I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her for a long moment. This woman who'd shown up for my grandmother for years out of love and loyalty, and then shown up for me out of something that, looking back, had been growing between us slowly enough that neither of us had rushed it or named it too soon. I reached over and took her hand. She didn't pull away. That winter, into early 2025, Claire and I became something neither of us had planned, but both of us, honestly, had seen coming for months. We weren't engaged. We weren't rushing anything. But we were together. Seriously, together. The kind where she kept a drawer of clothes at the main house, and I'd quietly started browsing rings on a trip into town, even though I hadn't said a word to her about it yet. By February 2025, the ranch had transformed. We had 30 head of grass-fed cattle on a rotational system, a signed supply agreement with 2 restaurants in Livingston and 1 in Big Sky, and my grandmother, now 87, sitting on the porch most afternoons watching her grandson rebuild the operation her son had once dreamed of running. The developer's buyout offer, which had arrived that January at a number that would have made most people's eyes water, sat unsigned in a drawer in my office. I had no intention of selling, not after everything that land had given back to me. I didn't know it yet, but Megan's life in Portland had not gone the way her mother promised it would. Here's something Diane Ashford never accounted for when she pushed her daughter toward a hedge fund manager with a corner office and an ex-wife he badmouthed on the first date. Men like Gordon Whitmore don't fall in love with women. They acquire them the way they acquire everything else, and they grow bored of acquisitions just as fast. Megan married Gordon in September 2024, 8 months after leaving me, at a vineyard wedding outside Portland that I only know the details of because Nicole Ferris, still keeping me loosely updated out of what I think was genuine sympathy, sent me a single text. She did it. I'm sorry, Ryan. I didn't respond. By then, I didn't need to. I had 30 head of cattle, a recovering heart, and a woman on my porch who'd never once made me feel like a liability. The marriage didn't last long. According to Nicole, who heard it secondhand from people still in that social circle, Gordon had a pattern. A young second wife, a prenup that protected almost everything he owned, and an attention span for marriage that rarely outlasted a year. Megan found out about another woman in June 2025, filed for divorce by July, and by August, with the prenup doing exactly what prenups are designed to do, walked away from that marriage with significantly less than she'd walked into it with. And a mother who, for the first time in Megan's adult life, didn't have an immediate next plan. I didn't know any of this in real time, of course. I was 3 states away, building something with my hands and with Claire, who by the spring of 2025 was no longer just a woman I was seeing. She was a woman I was planning a life with. In April 2025, I drove into town alone one afternoon and bought a ring. A simple one, the kind that suited her. No fuss, no flash, just something solid that would last. I hadn't asked her yet. I was waiting for the right moment, and some part of me, I think, was waiting for one more thing to settle first, though I couldn't have told you exactly what. That thing settled in February 2025, actually, a few months before I bought the ring, in a way I genuinely hadn't expected. My grandmother passed away peacefully in her sleep on a quiet morning that month, 87 years old, in the same house she'd lived in for over 5 decades. It wasn't sudden, not really. Her health had been declining gently for over a year, and she'd told me more than once in her final months that she was at peace with it, that she'd lived a long life on land she loved, surrounded by people who loved her back. Claire was there with me the morning we found her. I don't think I could have gotten through that week without her. My grandmother left the ranch to me outright in her will. No surprises there. But she also left something I hadn't expected. A handwritten letter, tucked inside her jewelry box, dated the previous autumn, addressed simply to my grandson. In it, she wrote that she'd watched me rebuild myself from nothing twice in one lifetime. Once after I lost my parents, and once after Megan left. And that both times, it was the land and the people who actually showed up for it that had put me back together. She wrote that she'd always liked Claire, in the quiet way you like someone who never once asked for anything and always gave everything anyway. And that if I hadn't already figured out what to do about that, I was, in her words, slower than your father, and he was slow. She asked only one thing of me: to keep the ranch in the family, to never sell it to anyone who'd turn good grazing land into vacation condos, no matter what number they offered. I proposed to Claire 2 months later, in April 2025, on that same porch, at sunset, with the ring I'd already been carrying around in my truck for weeks. I didn't make a production of it. I just handed her my grandmother's letter first, let her read it, and when she looked up with tears in her eyes, I got down on one knee. She said yes before I even finished the sentence, which, by then, felt like it was becoming a pattern with the women who actually stayed. We were married that October, a small ceremony right there on the ranch, under the same sky my grandmother used to watch cattle graze beneath. The Bennetts came. What was left of my Portland friends came, including Nicole, who hugged me tight and whispered that she was happy someone finally got the ending they deserved. There was no seating chart drama, no in-law power plays, no one whispering that I wasn't good enough or secure enough or recovered enough. Just people who had actually shown up, eating barbecue off paper plates at long tables in a field that, by then, was turning a real, sustainable profit for the first time in 3 generations. As for Megan, I heard, through the same secondhand channels that had kept me updated all along, that she moved back in with her mother that fall into a condo that felt considerably smaller than the vineyard wedding had promised. Diane, I'm told, has never once acknowledged that any of it was her doing. Some people just aren't built for that kind of honesty. I don't wish either of them anything cruel. I've simply stopped thinking about them, which, if you've ever been on the receiving end of a slow, deliberate abandonment, you'll know is its own kind of ending. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need revenge because life already handled the math for you. These days, the ranch runs 35 head of cattle and counting, supplies 4 restaurants across 2 counties, and has a waiting list of families in the valley who'd rather sell us their extra grazing land than take the developer's money. Claire and I are expecting our first child this winter. My grandmother's rocking chair still sits on that porch, and some evenings, when the light hits the fence line just right, I swear I can still feel her out there, watching the operation her son once dreamed of finally come all the way home. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's not really about revenge. It's about who's still standing next to you when you've got nothing left to offer but time and recovery. Everyone will tell you they love you when things are easy. Watch who stays when they're not. That's the only inheritance that ever really mattered on this land.